Okay, so what I'd like to present today is an argument that even though there's a fair bit of radical analysis in the Palestine movement, our theories of change remain rooted, for the most part, in the mythologies of liberalism. We still base a great deal of our activism and organizing work on the notions of civil society, the international legal regime, rights-based approaches, um, and kind of responsiveness of liberal democratic regimes. Even when it comes to some of our more material activities, such as the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement, oftentimes these boycotts are framed within the logic of capitalism as a kind of voting with your dollar, um, which isn't necessarily how such campaigns need to be viewed or approached, but it does tend to, that seems to be the great tendency. Another tendency is that we are increasingly talking about fascism, but oftentimes the word fascist comes in as a substitute for what we want to describe as brutal, tyrannical, authoritarian, militarist, all of which are aspects of fascism, but I believe miss out on what makes fascism different from other forms of authoritarian tyranny. I think one of the most important but understudied analyses of fascism comes from the head of the Italian Communist Party, who took over after the death of Antonio Gramsci, who was mentioned a few times yesterday. This is someone named Palmiro Togliatti. And Palmiro Togliatti gave these very important lectures on fascism in the mid 1930s while he was in the Soviet Union. And some of the very crucial salient points that he makes, and remember, this is him reflecting on the fascist takeover, Mussolini's fascist takeover of the Italian state over the course of the 1920s. Mussolini, who was originally a socialist, let's also kind of remember. Um, and he offers this definition, which is actually a definition that was used in the 13th meeting of the enlarged executive of the Communist International. And the definition is as follows: Fascism is the open terrorist dictatorship of the most reactionary, most chauvinistic, most imperialist elements of finance capital. So it's effectively that kind of tyrannical authoritarianism we associate with it, but when operating kind of in the interests and driven by what we today refer to as the billionaires. Um, a second aspect that Togliatti kind of highlights for us is that really what we're talking about here is monopoly capital, again, the billionaires, as the leading forces of the bourgeoisie. And what's important here is a kind of historical materialist trajectory of capitalist economics, which is that you have a stage of capitalism in which it is in the interests of capitalism for the state to come in and regulate competition and regulate against the monopolistic tendencies within capitalism, antitrust laws, a certain amount of redistribution of wealth that enables the system to keep going rather than constantly being in a state of crisis through labor unrest and so on. However, it reaches a point we've now reached in the last 5 to 10 years, in which that kind of regulation starts to operate as a fetter, as a chain, as an obstacle to monopolistic growth. And so the bourgeoisie then kind of turns to reactionary fascism. And so we see it very clearly. I'll come back to this. I'll kind of expand on this in a moment. But one final aspect of this is that Another aspect of fascism that differentiates it from kind of standard tyrannical, dictatorial authoritarianism is populism. Fascists win elections in a way that a dictator will win an election through force, through rigging an election, but if you actually had a free and fair election, they never would, right? And so Hitler, Mussolini, Trump, Modi, Bolsonaro, and so on, they will win a free and fair election, and they do, right? Obviously, there's kind of rigging and whatnot, these machinations. However, you will find that this populism wins elections. So it is also a popular movement, but it's often a popular move, or always, invariably, a popular movement that involves deception of the working class and the poor about where their interests lie. So to look at something like the world since COVID, because it's really since COVID that we have this massive redistribution of wealth. Um, Between 2020 and 2024, the world's five richest men more than doubled their fortunes, from about 400 billion to almost 870 billion pounds since 2020, while the wealth of the poorest 60%, almost 5 billion people, has dramatically fallen. There's a global redistribution and concentration of wealth into these billionaires' hands. And so we can kind of actually very markedly and in a very short period of time see this transformation towards from the role of the state being the kind of managing the monopolistic tendencies of capitalism into becoming a vehicle for the aggrandizement of billionaire wealth. And the concentration of this wealth. We also see it in Trump's tax policies, right, which are very clearly geared towards massive tax cuts for the hyper rich, with nominal reductions in tax burdens on working and middle class people. As a way of kind of softening the deal and enabling that kind of populism that we were talking about. Reduction on taxes on estate inheritances. We can kind of do a whole kind of example of this. And it's crucial to note here that that billionaire class, if we were to take a list of the top 10, top 40, top 50 billionaires in the US or even the world, especially when we add India into this mix, we find that all of these billionaires have very heavy investments in the Zionist project. Whether it's Elon Musk's Starlink, Microsoft, Google, Nvidia with AI, Amazon, even Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway has hundreds of millions of dollars at stake in the Israeli economy, and of course the Ellisons with Oracle, not to mention all of the arms, pharmaceutical, tech, and other AI companies that are deeply entrenched in the Israeli economy, but also the Israeli military industrial complex particularly. And this kind of co-creates a complete state-level support. So an already existing situation where these states, like the United States, Britain, most European countries, and so on, give full kind of backing politically, diplomatically, economically, in terms of military training and relations, police training and relations, border control regimes, the diamond trade, and so on. And we can never really overstate the degree to which the Zionist project, from its very inception and until today, was completely and utterly unviable without immense and unfaltering and unpausing imperial and Western support. Most of us know about the kind of like $3 to $5 billion a year of US taxpayer money, but this goes well before 1948. And from 1948 to 1952 alone, just the first 3 years, 4 years of the State of Israel, the United States alone gave well over $3.5 billion in today's terms. This is, the historical narrative is the US goes fully in support of Israel after 1967, but really we can see it right from the beginning. And this doesn't even count all of the unofficial support, all of the individual remittances from Zionist families and individuals and other supporters, military aid, tax cuts, intelligence support, and so on. This list we'll never really have the full comprehensive picture of this. Um, it's really instructive, and if you haven't seen it, I really recommend that everybody look up The Economist's interview with Steve Bannon. Steve Bannon is considered the leading ideologue of the MAGA movement, the Make America Great Again movement, Trump's movement. So basically, the same thing we would call US fascism. In this interview, at the very end, he actually talks about how the interview is being conducted in a room in which the meetings were happening from 2012 with Nigel Farage and with the leaders of the white supremacist and fascist movements across the European countries. But the interview itself has a lot to offer. So I really recommend, like, I wish I could just play it for you in its entirety. It's only about 12 minutes long. But he makes clear that the goal is a full takeover of the country, of its institutions, to purge these institutions. Um, it's framed as an impending economic crisis that's coming, and this is the only way to save America. He refers to Trump as a vehicle of divine providence and an instrument of divine will. Um, and it's very clear that the project here is a populist nationalist project to take over the apparatus of the state, carry out mass deportations, and consolidate a kind of global fascism, the kind of thing we would refer to as a conspiracy theory, except that it's being said out in the open and recorded and online for you all to see. I'm probably running out of time, but I have a few more things I would like to say. So
Valt de vloer van de voeten.
Talia, if you can hear us, please mute your microphone. So just some kind of notes on the kind of fascist hijacking of the liberal order. I think the really major canary in the coal mine, the warning sign that we should have got, was when there was the purge of the Labour Party and the Corbynist movement in Britain, that we know for a fact was orchestrated out of the Israeli embassy in London, together with the right wing of the Labour Party. We had a situation where where Keir Starmer was purging the Labour Party of its Jewish members who were anti-Zionist in the name of rooting out anti-Semitism in his party. Like George Orwell could not have made this up. We have a situation where universities and kind of civil society actors are volunteering to provide intelligence on their students to Israeli intelligence and the Mossad. We just heard yesterday that the French state is delivering data on its Muslim population to Israeli intelligence. Palantir, one of the most dangerous companies in the world, and very deeply embroiled in the Israeli security and military sector, as effectively is being given things like the National Health Service in Britain. You have the public extortion of International Criminal Court prosecutor and Francesca Albanese, who we heard from yesterday. And so it's all being done actually quite in the open, this kind of hijack. We have a restructuring of labor forces in the Imperial West. In Britain, for instance, there's a very clear cutting of jobs in the public sector, in the healthcare sector, in the education sector, and creation of jobs in the arms trade sector and the arms manufacture sector, an attempt to restructure the British working class in a way where it is structurally tied to the military industrial complex and the policing and prison industrial complex, the normalization of fascist practice. And so our theory of change, and here is the thing, one thing that Steve Bannon harps on and on and on about is that this movement is what he calls anti-fragile, what I'm calling fascist regime intransigence. And I think the poster childs for this kind of fascist intransigence are people like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir. They don't care what people who disagree with them will say. In fact, it will only make them more committed to carrying out their fascist practice and their fascist takeover. And so our theories of change, which are if we inform enough people, if the media can kind of get it right and help us inform enough people, if enough people knew, then they could create sustained mass mobilization that would then put pressure on elected representatives and on the structures of the state. And this will result in a change of policy. for 2+ years, we've had what is, and I don't think I'm exaggerating at all, the largest and most sustained anti-fascist global moment in human history. I don't think the world has witnessed a more sustained and more mobilized and in larger number movement on a global scale that is anti-fascist, anti-Zionist. Basically, if our theories of change were correct, then these states would have already changed their policies by now. But it hasn't been even 3 or 4 months since the state of Britain signed a £2 billion deal with Elbit Systems, the main manufacturer of Israeli weapons. And we're seeing increases in the connections and intertwining and support for the continued genocidal Zionist project. I think part of the blame also here comes to the way that we narrate the past struggles for justice and how they've attained their goals. We talk about India by fixating on Gandhi and nonviolence. Somehow we've transformed Nelson Mandela, who was the head of the Spears of the Nation, the armed wing of the African National Congress, right? Effectively, the South African equivalent of Mohammed al-Dayf. We have turned him into a figure of nonviolence and kumbaya, peace and love. We talk about the civil rights movement as this entirely kind of nonviolent movement. And so we've effectively kind of brainwashed ourselves in this historical narration into thinking that this sort of liberal theory of change, of like, if you want it enough, if you go sit in the street, if you are nonviolent, if you ask kindly, if you inform, and keep at it and maybe do some boycotting, that somehow this will bring about change. And what we've done is we've removed all of the actual things that enabled those struggles to achieve their victories against settler colonial and imperial violence. And so, and here we must remember what Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture said in 1966: in order for nonviolence to work, your opponent must have a conscience. And the United States has none. Obviously, Israel has none. This liberal theory of change requires that the receiving end, the decision maker, have what Kwame Ture referred to as a conscience, but effectively that this kind of are susceptible to this kind of pressure. And what's been proven very clearly in the last 2 to 2.5 years is that there is no such conscience. And so an genocide movement. And so in order for us to really think about how we're going to confront global fascism, we really have to deepen and entrench kind of more militant and revolutionary praxis, right? So a theory of change that is more about material transformation of society, and that is not just based on the raising of awareness and all of the things entailed by a liberal theory of change. And what we need is a revolutionary theory of change that highlights the fundamental necessity for material engagement, physically stopping things from moving, physically disabling the fascist machine. So I'll stop here. Thank you.